We know a dozen means 12 things. Here's a dozen chicken eggs, and here's a dozen jelly beans. By the way, an average egg weighs 49.6 grams, so a dozen egg is 595 grams. And an average jelly bean weighs 1.3 grams, so a dozen jelly bean is 16 grams. Notice that a dozen eggs weighs more than a dozen jelly beans, because an egg weighs more than a jelly bean. See this number right here? Is 602 sextillion, which is 602 billion trillion, or a mole for short. This number is given a very special name. It is called Avogadro's number. Writing out a mole by hand is really hard work. Using scientific notation, we can write 1 mole as 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd. This is shorter and easier to write. And to put things into perspective, if you could eat 1 trillion jelly beans a day, it would take you 602 billion days to eat 1 mole of jelly beans. Moles are very handy for counting enormous amount of things. See the carbon in this container? This is 1 mole of carbon. That is 602 billion trillion carbon atoms, or in scientific notation, 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd carbon atoms. So 1 mole of carbon equals 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd atoms, which we can write as 1 mole of carbon over 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd atoms, or 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd atoms over 1 mole of carbon. And we can use these ratios as conversion factors. See the copper in this container. This is 1 mole of copper. That is 602 billion trillion copper atoms, or in scientific notation, 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd copper atoms. So 1 mole of copper equals 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd atoms, which we can write as 1 mole of copper over 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd atoms, or 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd atoms over 1 mole of copper. And we can also use these ratios as conversion factors. Remember how a dozen jelly beans weighs less than a dozen eggs, even though they both have 12 items each? That is because, on average, a jelly bean weighs less than an egg. Likewise, a mole of carbon atoms weighs less than a mole of copper atoms. That is because, on average, 1 atom of carbon weighs less than an atom of copper. So, even though a mole of carbon in this container has the same number of atoms as a mole of copper in the other container, the mass of 1 mole of copper is bigger than the mass of 1 mole of carbon. In other words, copper has the bigger molar mass. By the way, a mole is not short for a molecule. For example, a molecule of oxygen has 2 oxygen atoms, and a mole of oxygen would have 602 billion trillion molecules of oxygen. So, 1 mole of oxygen molecules actually has 2 moles of oxygen atoms. Likewise, a molecule of nitrogen has 2 nitrogen atoms, and a mole of nitrogen would have 602 billion trillion molecules of nitrogen. So 1 mole of nitrogen molecules actually has 2 moles of nitrogen atoms.